do is I've actually tried. So what I've tried to do is I have actually tried to uh, basically look at from a different aspect. I think trying to give you postgraduate students and psychology students. I think Dr. Kunjan has joined with us with some a different aspect and different concept to see a frontal lobe, which is generally not being taught. We are taught that what are the tests for frontal lobe. We are taught how to go about how to evaluate for frontal lobe. Uh, but how to actually make and derive a concept and which test measures what specifically, I'll try to deal it. Now, see, we are talking about frontal lobe. So, it's important to realize that it constitutes 30% of the total cortical area. And, primates, we humans are primates, part of mammals, like we share it with apes, rhesus, monkeys. So, this frontal lobe is most evolved in primates. But now when we see most of the neuroscience studies, which are based structural studies, most functional studies, they now because of some recent regulations, they can't be done on primates. So now it is being done on house mouse, which is mus musculus. Now it's a big limitation. Why? Because house mouse cytoarchitecture doesn't match with primates architecture or humans architecture. Okay. So now going back to the history. So if I go back to the history, so when we see this prefrontal, when I was seeing, it was first mentioned in a publication by Ferrier et al. At 1884. So first mention of this term prefrontal, when we say frontal lobe, was used by Ferrier et al. Now, frontal lobe is distinguished from other lobes by this presence of a distinct granular layer. So this is a granular layer. You can see this is first granular layer because this is second granular layer. So this is what differentiates frontal lobe from other lobes. And this is the most important part, probably a take-home message. And it's a characteristic of frontal region in primates or humans. So this, we see this. So actually, I've taken it from a publication. This blue layer is a granular layer. When I remove, and most of the frontal, you can see frontal lobe is blue. If we remove this frontal layer, then we can see this orange color layer. This is anterior cingulate cortex or anterior cingulate ACC, and this is yellow. This is agranular. So the only part of frontal lobe which is agranular is anterior cingulate cortex. So most of the part of the frontal lobe is granular, and only agranular part of the frontal lobe is anterior cingulate cortex. Now, a very interesting definition, a connectivity definition, basically a connection-based definition of frontal lobe or prefrontal cortex. I'll come to the details. What do you exactly know by prefrontal cortex? What we know by frontal lobe? Very interestingly, and it has lasted for last 70 years. And frankly, it was news to me because we would study connections, but the connection-based definition of some lobe was a news to me also. See, we can see this. This is a medial, this medial lobe. This is thalamus, and this is medial thalamus. MD, which they call it MD. So whatever connections this medial thalamus is having with the cortex, that connection based area of the cortex is known as frontal lobe or prefrontal cortex. Now this is very interesting because, and it has this definition has lasted 70 years. There are few exceptions. Some of the areas of frontal lobe, they are connected with other nucleus of thalamus, and some part of medial thalamus is connected to other areas of other than frontal lobe. But this is an important definition of prefrontal cortex. Now, when we see prefrontal cortex as such, when we see the functions, so we can see there is a motor cortices. We know this. There is a motor cortices. and there is a supplementary motor area. I'll come to that. Then there is frontal eye fields. But in this presentation, I'm not concerned about all these three. Apart from all these three, there is known as something known as prefrontal functions, which we'll be dealing. And generally, as a psychiatrist, we measure or assess these prefrontal functions. Now we can see these prefrontal functions, and executive function is part of this prefrontal functions. So I'm not concerned about motor cortices. I'm not concerned about supplementary motor area, frontal eye fields, which generally neurologists will deal more with. We are concerned about prefrontal function. And let me tell you, this is the most recent evolved terminology. So we now they don't call these functions as executive functions. We call them premotor functions. And executive functions are part of the premotor functions. Now coming to this diagram, which will help us to understand what I'm trying to say. This is central sulcus, and this is a primary motor area. Again, because if we talk about frontal lobe test, we're not concerned about primary motor area. It's more of a part of an examination of neurological examination. Then this is premotor area. This is anterior to it. Then this is frontal eye fields. So these three areas I'm excluding. And this view is a lateral view. It's a lateral view of the cortex. And this is a medial view of the cortex. So what is left is four parts of prefrontal cortex. So four parts of prefrontal cortex, what all they are? One is, this is dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is orbital part of prefrontal cortex. This is orbital part. If we see this from medial part, this becomes orbital part. So dorsolateral 1, orbital part 2, and then this is the third part I'm talking about, which is named as 2 here. 2 is anterior cingulate or ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So there are three parts: dorsolateral, orbitofrontal, and ventromedial or anterior cingulate cortex. Now fourth part, because now when we say prefrontal cortex, it is divided into 4 zones. So fourth part is this frontal pole. So frontal pole, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, DLPFC, orbitofrontal cortex, and ventromedial or anterior cingulate cortex. I hope I am there with all of you. Did you understand this? Someone can unmute and say yes or no.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now when we see Brodmann, so Brodmann, when we talked about initially about granular part, granular and agranular regions of prefrontal cortex. So Brodmann then, because based on these architectural differences, they separated all these areas and gave them these areas name as Brodmann areas. So we can see traditionally they are defined as Brodmann area 8 to 14. We can see 8, 9, 10, 11, then 12, 13, 14 are inside this. And then Brodmann area 44 to 47, 44, 45, 46, 47. So these are all granular. And when we talk about agranular, as I said, anterior cingulate cortex is agranular. You can see Brodmann 24, the 25 is inside, 31, 32. Okay, so that is how Brodmann also differentiated quite, maybe 5 decades, 6 decades back, and he was ahead of its times. Now we have basically we have progressed from a historical definition, then a definition of prefrontal cortex, that it is connected with medial thalamus nucleus, which has lasted tested times. Then its evolution, historical aspects we have seen. Now important is functional aspects. We all have read about CSTC circuits, cortico-striato-thalamo-cortical circuits. It was, when it was reported, you'll be surprised, Alexander et al. Gave it in 1986. So it's such an old concept. We feel that CST circuits are latest concepts. No, it is a very old concept. Cortico-striato means basal ganglia, thalamus, cortical. Again, good goes back to cortical. CSTC circuits or circuits. So motor area, as I already mentioned in my previous slide, that I'm not concerned about this primary motor cortex, supplementary motor area, or frontal eye fields, because this is what more of a neurologist will deal. Now, our basically in psychiatry or psychology or neuropsychology, we are more or less concerned with this cognitive and social emotional aspects. So we can see DLPFC, we have seen that area. Then there is dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, lateral prefrontal cortex. Again, these are both together. Anterior cingulate, that is medial, and orbitofrontal. So we can see all these are connected to this basal ganglia, then this part of basal ganglia, then this thalamus, and then again back to the cortex. So all these are CSTC circuits. And very strikingly, these highlighted parts is medial nucleus of thalamus. So this is common. That is the concept I want to actually bring across this presentation. That prefrontal cortex, most important connection is from thalamus is medial nucleus of or mediodorsal nucleus of thalamus. MD, that is. Now, functional definition. Now we come to functional definition of this presentation. Now, which will help us in doing tests for frontal cortex. So when we talk about functional definition of functional prefrontal functions, the most imbibed, simplified, and acceptable definition, model-based definition was given by Stoss, and a very impressive article. I recommend everyone should read it, and very highly cited article. So it said that prefrontal cortex are, the functions are divided into 5 domains. First is energization, that how much energy I show. Like I'm doing this presentation with a lot of energy. Then task setting. Task setting means when we are maybe like when we are uh, basically devising an academic schedule. So with Dr. Veena and myself are devising an academic schedule, or Dr. Dhyani is devising an academic schedule. So we are setting a task. We are actually planning it, and we are actually series of sequencing it and giving each of the residents and including myself the topics to present and making a timetable. This is task setting. Then monitoring becomes whether the timetable is being followed, time to time, whether there are no the stops, pauses on this. Then once you have set the task, then whether the task is being followed, the process is monitoring. Then behavioral and emotional regulation or dysregulation, and metacognition. Metacognition is understanding others' perspective or mental states. So these 5 tasks are done by prefrontal cortex. I'm not talking about frontal lobe. Frontal lobe has motor area, supplementary motor area, frontal eye fields. Those 3 areas I'm not talking in this presentation. Now, what are the equivalent areas which carry out these functions? That is why I'm saying that this model is very safe model. So energization, am I audible? I think there is no issues. Energization is done by anterior cingulate cortex. Energization is energy, the amount of energy I'm putting it, the inertia, the less inertia I'm showing. Task setting of the task is by left part of the DLPSC. Monitoring is by the right part of DLPFC. Emotional and behavioral regulations are by orbitofrontal cortex, and metacognition is by frontal cortex. Now, what we will be doing it, I will now in the next few slides, I'll take each of these functions by each of these specific areas, and I'll just explain how we test it bedside. Now, any assessment, any cognitive assessment, it starts from history taking. Now, that is a very important thing. Behavioral observation, because many a times patient might not be communicable. Patient might have aphasia, patient might have some cognitive deficits or catatonia. So we need a very astute observation. So good psychiatrist is a very astute observer. And then we come to formal training for formal testing. Now, history, many a times, neuroscientists, they say that history is very important than examination. Now, there is a specific reason for that, because most of these concepts of examination have come up by old established literature, where the lesions were very broad. So lesions were not restricted to very specific areas of frontal lobe. There were huge lesions. So many a times examinations will give you various overlap findings, and you will not be able to localize it to one specific function. So history becomes very important. And in history, you need to see a medical history to see whether obstructive sleep apnea, for example, because if OSA is there, daytime cognitive deficits will be more. You'll feel that executive dysfunction is there, but that could be because of hypersomnolence. Then any psychiatric history of substance use disorders, because in withdrawal phases you will find these deficits. Psychosocial, educational issues, because then you need to interpret your test findings with the educational status of the patient. Occupational issues and description of symptoms of executive function. So we need to also specifically ask the family members about specific functions which can be which can which can signate executive dysfunction. Like, for example, anyone can say what guardians might give us the history. What guardians might give us the history. Okay, so maybe the guardians will tell that see, the person is having an issue with performance of a task setting error here. So guardians will tell us that the patient is having a problem with doing similar tasks now. Patient is not able to carry out the similar task that patient was doing before. And if monitoring error hai, the guardians will say that patient would start to do the activities previously learned, but is unable to carry out those activities. Or patient is able to do established activities, executive dysfunction results in patient unable to do new goals or new activities or learn new events. So this kind of an history should be asked from the patients, guardians. Observation interview has already entailed that behavioral observation towards the examiner, the patient's posture, eye contact, which can be fleeting if executive dysfunction is there, interactiveness, the patient is not interacting, is in his own environment, maybe apathetic, level of effort can signate towards apathy, or the utilization behavior where patient will try to hold on to events in front of him, or environmental dependency, which we call. Is patient very distractible? So patient is having inattentive behavior, any disinhibition is there, so which points out towards orbitofrontal cortex dysfunctions, any diurnal variations, which can obviously point out towards any delirious phenomena. Then responsiveness to stimuli or events, whether speech is tangential, speech is with interpolations, or speech is goal directed, and most importantly, thought and perceptual abnormalities. Now, when we go to assessment of frontal lobe, very importantly, we need to rule out whether patient's level of consciousness is intact or not. Because cognitive examination will go for a toss if the consciousness is impaired. So consciousness, we talk in two contexts, content and arousability, whether the depth of the consciousness and how and what the patient, what is the content of the consciousness of the patient. So when we talk about arousability, is the patient alert, patient is lethargic, obtunded, stupor, or comatose. So remember, you can only test, I have highlighted alert here because you can only test these cognitive functions if patient is alert. Other than that, maybe if patient is on injections, injectables, patient is lethargic, you can't test these cognitive functions. Then they will be misleading. So when we see arousability, we need to see intensity of stimulation needed to arouse. Like when we call a patient in a conversational tone, loud voice, light touch, or vigorous shaking, or painful stimulation. So these are glaucoma scales variations. Then recording the best response was eye opening, verbal response, or motor response. I'll not go into the details because these are outside purview of this current presentation. I'm just putting it the context for the sake of continuity. And what patient does on cessation of stimulation. Important is you give a stimulation, record it, how much vigorous stimulation was given, then record the best response, and then record what happens when stimulation goes off. Now coming to assessment of frontal lobe per se. Importantly, no single test will do for you. So no single test will say that frontal lobe is impaired or not. It is comprehensive enough to tell you. So we need with the help of a lot of conglomerate of tests. Now coming to the first domain of anterior cingulate cortex related to energization. Energization is the level of energy or the input patient is putting. So if there is a deficit with energization or anterior cingulate cortex lesion, so or it is not working, so it can vary from apathy to akinetic mutism. Now, what is apathy? Can anyone share what is apathy? So we have 15 participants. I think now a lot of psychologist friends have also joined us. What is apathy? Okay, apathy is a syndrome characterized by lack of initiation and drive. So patient will be indifferent, and when we try to talk to the patient will not show any initiation and drive will be less. So we say patient is having apathy, and it is in milder variety of anterior cingulate cortex problems. And abulia is a neurological term. So psychiatrists will use apathy. Abulia is used by neurology. So there is no much difference in these two terms. And when this energization deficit increases many folds, patient lands into akinetic mutism. What is it? It's total inability to initiate any internally derived activity, but basic sensations and motor functions and ability to react to external stimuli is intact. And it is found in double bilateral lesions of anterior cingulate cortex. For example, this butterfly, glioma. So you can see this butterfly glioma, and you can see it is displays this medial part of this frontal lobe. And this medial part of the frontal lobe is nothing but anterior cingulate cortex. So double fly glioma can slowly present with akinetic mutism. Now, which test we can perform at the bedside? This is interesting question to assess the whether that specifically anterior cingulate cortex is performing or not. Now, interestingly, when we see any test can be performed, and we see because of energization deficit, because of anterior cingulate cortex not working, patient will be very slow in the test performance. So, a speed-based test, patient will not be able to perform those tests based on the time. Patient might complete it, but very slowly. Number one. Another very important test is this phonemic or lexical word fluency test, or FAS test. Now, this test is based upon that when we ask the patient to actually, we'll give a patient one alphabet and we'll ask the patient to recite the various words in 1 minute, and and we should count the number of words recited in that 1 minute, but we should exclude proper nouns, the names, the numbers, and multiple versions of single word like kela, akela, so like that. And if they are more than 12 per minute, the energization deficit is not present. So patient's anterior cingulate gyrus is working. Now, I have not put here animal naming test specifically, which I will be telling you later on. Now coming to now coming to the other part of the prefrontal cortex, left DLPFC, which is it determines task setting, and right DLPFC, which determines monitoring. Now, again, I've discussed history. We can actually have a lot of cues in the history. As I told, as I mentioned, that patients, guardians will tell you that patient is not able to carry out routine activities as before or newer activities as before. Frontal speech pattern. There will be a classical speech pattern which is known as frontal speech pattern in these patients, where patients may speak in grammatically correct sentences with normal syntax, but content may be described as vague or confused, and we might feel that patient is circumstantial. So this frontal speech pattern might come up in these patients. And when we ask these patients, we should ask them to discuss or write down examples of how they would go about planning something new, and we should note the response. So when we see the response, they will not be able to concretize their response, and we will feel that the speech is vague or circumstantial or confused. This is a subfrontal speech pattern which might give us a clue that there is a problem with DLPFC. Now, this we all know, we are all fond of digit repetition or digit span, which is also known as digit forward. It's a most universally task for assessing attention by clinicians, and provides gross index of attention, and result on this task is indicative of simple attention. So digit forward is not a task for DLPFC. I've just put it for the sake of continuity. Digit backward is a task for DLPFC, but coming to digit forward, still, I'll tell the patients I'm going to say some numbers. Listen carefully, and when I'm finished, say the numbers after. Present the digits in a normal tone of voice at a rate of 1 digit per second, and you should have a prior written series of digits. That is very important. Begin with a two-number sequence and continue until the patient fails to repeat all the numbers correctly. Now, scoring is, we say that 5 to 7 or 6 plus minus 1 is fine. And if patient is elderly or intellectually impaired, 5 can be a cutoff. Then coming to digit backward, which is more relevant to the current presentation. So digit backward not only tells us about working memory, we all know that. It also tells us about task setting and monitoring. So digit backward scoring is generally -1 than that of digit forward. That is why digit forward is important, because every patient will have his or her unique score. So we do a digit forward in one patient, see the score, and then if digit backward is less than 1 in that patient, then the score is fine. But if we see digit forward and digit backward score difference is more than 2, then we should feel that there is an imbibing executive dysfunction coming up. Now MoCA, we all are very favorite of MoCA. MoCA incorporates both digit forward and digit backward, and MoCA gives a score of 1. Sorry. Now coming to other assessments for DLPFC, then we know Luria, Nebraska, neuropsychological battery. There is a hand sequence which is known as fist edge palm test, as shown in this video, or in Hindi we say muthi haath kinara. So muthi haath kinara, first you have to do with the patient, ask him to follow the task, and then subsequently perform it independently. If patient is able to perform the task with cues initially, then there is no task setting error. And subsequently patient commits an error, then it is a monitoring error. And patient is not able to perform the task initially, then there is a task setting error. So that is how you can see left is involved, right is involved. Now, this is in basically a sequence task. We have a pen, paper, a pencil and paper is required. And let me tell you how it is done. So we actually write this initial few sequences here. We draw this and we make these dots and ask the patient to follow it up till the end of the page. And you can see in this, patient started with a triangle. So this is a task setting error which patient has done. And then subsequently patient continued to follow this 2 triangles and 1 rectangle, 2 triangles and 1 rectangle, and then monitoring error came up. So initially only patient started with a wrong response. So set shifting is not done properly. So rectangle, triangle, rectangle, triangle, rectangle should have come up. So this is an abnormal response. Then another very interesting task is multiple loops task. Now, multiple loops task, how it is done? Because many of us do it, but we don't do it correctly. In a sheet of paper in the corner, we should draw 3 loops. 3 loops comprising of 3 loops, or 3 sets of multiple loops comprising of 3 loops. And we should draw these dots and explain the patient, kindly draw it till the page ends. Now there can be a problem with the patient with this task setting. Patient will draw it below this. And if patient draws below this, not horizontally or vertically, then this is a task error. And what you can see in this 4th line, interestingly, he has drawn 3. 3, 3, 3. So this he has drawn wrong. This is again a task setting error. And if patient, and you can see this again, same thing, patient was shown and patient was asked to draw till the end of the page, and patient continued to draw this loops. These are perseveratory errors. So these kind of errors can come up, and these are very interesting phenomena. Now, another way to test this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex errors is go-no-go test, given in Luria, Nebraska, and also frontal assessment battery. So these go-no-go tests, we ask the patient to tap once, patient should tap once. And if we tap twice, patient should not tap. So this actually works on the principle of reciprocal inhibition, and it tests your DLPFC functions. Again, a very interesting task. Now here I have put animal naming text because animal naming text is based on the semantic fluency, where the words are expressed in form of some categories which are better defined by dorsolateral prefrontal cortex than anterior cingulate cortex. That is why animal naming test is known as one of the most sensitive tests for frontal lobe dysfunction. You ask the patient कि 1 मिनट है आपके पास जितने जानवरों के नाम आते हैं आप बताइए. If they are more than 12, then the response is fine. Less than 12, then the deficit is there, more so in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, could also be in anterior cingulate cortex. Now coming to this assessment of frontal lobe, again, when we see trail making test, this trail making test has 25 circles. Patient should draw from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 and so on and so forth till 25. And this actually tests will assess energization process of prefrontal cortex functions, along with that sustained attention and all. Now there are few norms for these tests. Will not go into detail. Trail making B where patient will have 13 circles, 1 to 13, and A to L alphabets, and patient has to draw from 1 to A to 2, 2 to B, and this test will actually assess set shifting or executive functions per se. So trail making A is for energization and trail making B is for executive dysfunction. Now, another important way to assess DLPFC is abstract thinking. So we are very fond of abstract thinking. We generally catch our postgraduate students in this presentation, in this part of their cognitive examination. Now, when we see proverbs, see, let me tell you, proverbs are not very reliable because proverbs answering is based upon your predetermined knowledge about language. And if patient with intact, prefrontal functions, they have not heard a proverb, patient will not be able to answer that. So proverbs are less reliable than similarities. So the more similarities will signify more of abstract thinking deficits, which are again part of DLPFC. And specifically in DLPFC, abstract thinking is defined by left perisylvian cortex, which is between Broca's and Wernicke's area. So again, very interesting test, very simple test कि जी आप दो चीजों बताइए उन्हें कि एक कुर्सी में और मेज में क्या समानता है या किस कैटेगरी को बिलोंग करते हैं, तो फिर the patient will tell you the answer, and when patient will tell us the answer, the left perisylvian cortex it fires up. Coming to the third part of the prefrontal cortex or orbitofrontal cortex, which is the basal area, emotional and behavioral regulations are found. Let me tell you, behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia, it specifically hits this area. And emotional and behavioral dysregulation and altered social cognition are found in orbitofrontal cortex. And these are the various features where we will get. And this all things can be asked in history. So there is no specific test to determine. So environmental dependency, where patient will go for more, catching things around the environment. Hyperphagia, patient will eat more. Altered food preferences, altered sexual preferences, then inappropriate jocularity, lack of social decorum or argumentative. Patient will be capricious or impulsive, narrowed preoccupations, and even criminal behaviors. So you will, when we see all these things in context of the clinical scenario, we can say the orbitofrontal cortex is involved. Now the last part, or frontal pole, which we say. So frontal pole, as we can see, this is the anterior most part of the frontal lobe, and it defines metacognition. That is ability to take the perspective of others and self-awareness. So whether I am able to understand what others are thinking, whether I am able to understand what others are feeling, whether I am able to understand and can influence others' thinking. So this is metacognition. So in history only we will define, it can be made out that whether the patient shows sympathy, whether if the family member is crying, patient shows the emotional reciprocation towards a family member or is empathetic towards patient's family members' problems. The patient is empathetic towards the associated family members' problems or not. Now there is one test to assess this metacognition. This is not an Indian-based test. So that is Sally Any test, where Sally will take a ball, will put in a box, and Sally will go out. Patient will be shown this. Then what will do, it will take that ball from the box and put it into another box. And when patient and Sally when returns to the room, patient will be asked that what is the thinking, what Sally is thinking, where is the ball. So patient will be asked to judge the aspect of the aspect of others. So this is how I conclude the presentation. So the take-home points in this presentation is prefrontal cortex is agranular and prefrontal cortex is connected to mediodorsal nucleus of the thalamus. Prefrontal cortex functions are anterior cingulate cortex results in energization. DLPFC is related to task setting. I think some of you have should unmute. Dr. Veena, you should unmute. Yes. The right DLPFC is monitoring. The left DLPFC is task setting. Then orbitofrontal cortex is related to behavioral and social disinhibition, and frontal poles with metacognition. So I think this tells us a very basic, simplified, more comprehensible understanding of frontal lobes, and then we can develop onto this later on. Any questions and comments from the audience? My few psychologist friends have also joined from outside. So any questions and comments from the audience? So, you all can ask some questions. You put me into a corner. I generally ask all of you some questions. You can throw some questions to me. I'll not mind it. So good. I get a chance to escape. I've not been put into difficult positions. Thank you so much. I think tomorrow's presentation is by Dr. Priya or Dr. Akriti is delayed because the pediatric department has got COVID, and they want a physical conference. So physical academics on physical basis, not on hybrid basis. So tomorrow's academic is cancelled. I think on Saturday, we have some academic on Saturday.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes,
Okay.
case conference.
Okay. So thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the patient listening. We'll end this meeting.